Good morning, everyone. We're very glad you're joining us at Horizon this morning. Come on in if you're joining us at the 10 o'clock service. We are continuing today in the Fine Wine series, learning how to cultivate our family heritage into a lasting legacy. Glad you're here.
How we start from grape to bottle is really you have to plan about 6 years ahead of time. We order in the vines or propagate them ourselves. Before you even get the first grape, it takes 3.5, sometimes 4 years for that. They're all hand harvested. They're brought in by hand. They're crushed, pressed out. They're fermented on the skin, sometimes for up to a month, and then they're pressed out, fermented. So even by the time you plant the first grape, or the vine in the ground, you won't even have your first bottle of wine for 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
So it takes a lot of time to plan, forecasting. The pros and cons of a vineyard being run by with family is the family. If it was all paid employees, paid staff, yes or no answers would be very easy. Being family, there's some of us that are owners, there's some of us that work here. That is the hardest part. My grandfather's always been like, one day I will love the fact that I got to work with him. He said, I know that I'm a pain, but when you're my age, you'll love it. My older sister now is in it, a few cousins, things like that. It has its pros and its cons, which is why we all have our favorite managers to be able to delegate the bad news. Generational impact of a vineyard is, I think foreboding is the right word, because everybody that I meet that has a third or fourth generation family business reminds me that 98% go out of business on the third generation. So what grandma, grandpa, great-grandparents did in the 20s, buying the farm and then the vineyard in the 60s and the 70s, that's the biggest pressure, is basically to slightly improve, tweak, slightly modernize, but not kill the dream. You know, a lot of people, I'm 33 now. When I was younger, I thought I wanted to reinvent the wheel. I visited a lot of other similar businesses and going, the ones that had changed dramatically, those are the ones that go away. The ones that you keep the same feel, spirit, but sort of keep up with the times, but keep the tradition, those are the ones that usually last. So, you know, I'm not going to come in and rip out all the vineyards because I don't think that Grandpa planted the right variety. You know, we'll plant new ones and add on. So if that makes sense.
You know, one of the things I love about that song is it gives voice to the idea that we all want a great harvest. Whether you're 7, whether you're 20, whether you're 30 or 60, we all have dreams of great things happening. And at each stage you're offered something that's going to make life happy. You know, it's finding a right wife. It's making the 6-figure income. And yet I love when he gets to the end, he says, I'm 60 years old. My dad got 61. And what I'm hoping is that relationships will matter, that my kids will come and visit me once or twice, that I'll leave a legacy into my kids' and grandkids' lives as well. In fact, Lucas Graham is the writer of this song. He had the other line that says, I wrote a letter once, and I made a man so happy. 4 weeks ago, when we began the series Fine Wine, we made a list of all the character qualities we could honor our parents and grandparents for. And I don't know about you, but I felt really motivated to call my parents in the same way that Lucas Graham said that he wrote a letter. I made a phone call to my mom separately from my father and just said, hey, Mom, I want to let you know, this morning I was reflecting on the ways you impacted me. And I mentioned several of the characteristics of selflessness and the kindness and the responsibility. And I called my dad separately, and both of them were like, man, you know, even at 65, 67, I feel like, you know, we're still making mistakes, and I wonder if we really make an impact. They mean so much that you called. Because their hopes of impacting a legacy and having a great harvest are still there. And so as we explore Fine Wine, the process of how we go from the roots that have impacted us to the fruit that comes out of us, it's a chance for us to dream about and find the great harvest we can have in our families. But here's the question. If everyone has the dreams of a great harvest, then why do so many of us miss out on it? I mean, why do we look at our parents and say, man, why did they settle for that kind of marriage? It could be so much better. Why do you look at, you know, grandma or grandpa or somebody in your family reunion, you're like, how can they not know they're so crabby? How can they not know they're so critical? How can they be so clueless not to see the issue that everyone else sees, right? And you probably have a list. If I could change one thing about my grandmother, it would be. If I could change one thing about my mom, it would be. And the same way you have a list of things you can see in your relatives, your kids and grandkids are going to have a list for you. And often it's the anger It's the bitterness, it's the melancholy, it's the overdrivenness or over-responsibility that we have that creates a bad taste in the wine that is coming out of our lives and families. And I want to propose to you that God has a process in place that the bad taste of today's wine may be caused by unpruned sour grapes from the past. The bad taste of today's wine, things we wrestle with in our relationships, things we struggle with, today's wine, what we're experiencing, may go back 6, 10 years, 20 years, because we didn't prune the sour grapes from yesterday. And I want to walk you through a process of how do we identify those sour grapes that we alluded to 3 weeks ago, and then how do we literally begin to prune those things to identify them so that we can leave a legacy for our kids and grandkids that is even better than the great legacy left to us by our grandparents as well. And my hope is that we can break these generational patterns and set up freedom for the generations that come before us. We've been looking at this sort of interesting proverb in the book of Ezekiel. And the first thing we're going to look at is sour grapes. How do we take responsibility today for yesterday's influence? God comes to the people and says, hey, you guys are using this proverb that I want you to stop using. I hear everyone saying, well, because my parents ate sour grapes, therefore the children's teeth are stained or set on edge. Which was an ancient proverb basically saying, I can't help that I'm angry, my father was angry. I can't help that I'm really a worrier, my mother was a worrier. I can't really change the fact that I have a tendency to be really bitter. Our whole family sort of celebrated bitterness. I don't really forgive well because in my family, if you forgave, people took that, put it in a gun and shot you with it for 10 years. And you remember you said you did this 5 years ago. And God says, I want you to no longer use this proverb. Though, and I think this is key, though our parents' mistakes contributed to who we are, they don't control who we'll become. Though our parents' mistakes contributed to who we are, God's saying, don't use this proverb. It doesn't define. It doesn't control who you're going to become. And there's 2 ways at which the sour grapes or mistakes our parents make control us. And I'll give you 2 of them here as you look at the next part of the passage. This phrase, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and therefore the children's teeth are set on edge. It's a Hebrew phrase that literally means any feeling of unpleasant distaste in your mouth. And you go, man, I've got these goals of who I want to become, but I can't seem to get there. This is bad taste in the way I'm relating or handle my conflict or the way I'm able to grieve things or don't even have that vocabulary for it. There's a bad taste in my life, and I'm not sure why. It's because you're still controlled by the past. And there's 2 ways that we can be controlled by the sour grapes of the past. One is repeat, and the other is react. Repeat is we end up doing the very things modeled for us because we've never taken time to examine what was modeled for us and see if it's the healthiest thing. So part of the process God lays out is don't be controlled by the sour grapes of the past because you're repeating patterns that you don't even realize you're repeating. You just think it's normal. The other way that the past controls us is that we react to it. We're constantly living in reaction to, I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm not going to be like my mom. I'm not going to be that. And I'm still being controlled by the past. In one way I repeat, in the other way I react. And God says, no longer use this proverb. All souls are mine, the soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son. That you can make individual decisions to not be controlled by the past. I'll give you an example. Repeating the patterns of the past is easy to see. Grandma was a worrier, Mom was a worrier, I'm a worrier. I'm repeating the past. Reacting from the past is equally as controlling, but it's harder to diagnose. I remember a friend of mine, he said, my parents growing up were really good at prioritizing their marriage. They were always going on a date, always going on a trip, but they never had time for us. And so I'm not going to be that parent. I'm not going to do that to my kids. I'm going to make sure I invest in my kids. And he, the coach, he was involved so much so that he was always, the motivation for what he was doing was in reaction to what his parents didn't do. It wasn't, hey, my parents did a great job with marriage. I want to honor that. And they didn't do a great job of being involved. I want to change that. That's responding. Reacting is his priorities were always in reaction to what his parents didn't do. And so he lost his first marriage because though he was prioritizing his other interests, he didn't actually prioritize his marriage. It's not that he didn't want his marriage to be well, but his decisions were being made in reaction to something else. Here's another way it shows up. So my wife grew up in a family that there's a lot of poverty and a lot of need, and so money was a constant subject of conflict. And so when we got married, we really committed that we were not going to get ourselves in debt, and they were only going to live within our means. And so we set up a giving fund so that we could, give to people who in need. We set up a vacation fund, and we didn't have a lot of money, but I remember in our 20s saying, hey, what should we do with our next vacation? And immediately she got tense. Immediately there was just this unnecessary tension to the conversation. I'm like, honey, we're talking about vacation here. What's going on? And because every time money had been discussed growing up, it was always tense, there was a reaction. We weren't repeating the mistakes, but that what was modeled, and that friction was actually occurring right here before us. A good rule of thumb is, when you find yourself getting hysterical, whatever hysterical looks like for you, fear, worry, anxiety, stress, anger, when you get hysterical, it's usually historical. There's usually something going on in the background. And so over the last 20 years, we've really worked through not living in reaction to what our parents... Because my parents didn't have money, well, I'm going to drive. I can't set boundaries. I can't have a rest because I'm not going to be like my parents. That's reaction. It's not repetition, but it's reaction. William Wordsworth has a great quote. He says that one of the things we need to wrestle with in our life if we're going to make progress is that the child is the father of the man. That inside each one of us is that 7-year-old boy, that 10-year-old boy. It may not show up all the time. In fact, our public self is very mature, very responsible, looks really good. But there's this little 7-year-old, 8-year-old still in us that pops up in our private life. And everybody says, oh my goodness, you guys have the perfect marriage. Oh, I wish we could be like you. And you're like, come visit us sometime. Actually, we'll pretend we're nice. As soon as you come in, we fight. Hi, how's it going? Come on in. He'll do that. And he reckons that if we don't resolve or prune these sour grapes, that there's two versions of the inner child that takes control in our private moments. What he calls the driven child, he or she bawls and brawls when hurt, when you don't get your way. He or she rushes in and doesn't wait his turn. He or she is very demanding. And man, I can see that in my life. There's just areas and subjects that driven child shows up. Then there's also the scared child that shows up when a subject like money comes up, or feeling insecure comes up, or feeling disrespected comes up. The scared child is that version of ourselves within ourselves that's timid and fearful. As Doug talked about last week, we can negotiate the biggest deal, but we're not sure we can call our dad and say, I'm sorry. Suddenly this timid, scared child comes out who can't make friends or speak up. And in his work as a psychologist, William Wordsworth said there's 4 major categories that the child within us seems to take over in his work. In the area of affection, suddenly this inner child that's very insecure or this driven child takes over. The area of money brings out our inner child to take control. The area of sex, which he differentiates between affection. And when it comes to disciplining our children, all of that baggage from the past comes into the moment. I was reading a book called Putting Away Childish Things, and he gives a couple stories in reference to that. A husband describing how he still reacts to the past says this: when I walk in the door, all of a sudden I'm just a frightened little boy again, with mom fussing at me. Instead of telling my wife I've missed her all day, I scold her about some fool thing. I start out to love her and I end up hurting her. Now the wife says, I'm all right until my husband begins to discipline the children. And then I just can't stand it. I know that he isn't being too hard on them. I know that I'm spoiling them and ruining them. I know they need to be disciplined at times. But the minute he starts, I can see my dad all over again. And I end up fighting with my husband. I feel like a frightened little girl. And there's 2 honest people saying, boy, I'm still reacting to my past in these circumstances right now. I haven't unpruned myself from the past. Here's one more story about a guy who was beginning to go through the pruning process of finding freedom. His name was Mike. Mike is a churchgoer, he's a leader, he's a Sunday school teacher, but he could never quite believe that God loved him. He counseled together with the writer of the book, and as they counseled together several times, several pictures arose in Mike's mind as to why he couldn't connect with his Heavenly Father. One of which was a very binding, grinding, and searing scene. The memory was central to his childhood, so dominant that he was still seeing it in nightmares. See, his father had been a harsh disciplinarian, and he'd punish Mike very severely every time he did even a childish wrong. His father would shut him up inside a little room in the barn. There he would strap him severely until Mike was screaming for mercy, crying for his mother and his father and sisters to come and let him out. He'd run for the door of the barn, but his father would get there first and stand at the door barring the way. He would then order Mike, "Say you're sorry!" He'd repeat this over and over again until the hysterical little boy would finally say he was sorry, and then the father would force Mike to embrace him. All the resentment, hurt, and terrifying fear from that child was still there in his voice at age 50. They began to pray together, and as I was praying, I realized that God was telling me that Mike was still in that little barn. I realized that emotionally Mike was still in the barn. He had never gotten outside the door. He lived in that barn for 15 years without getting around his father and out of the door. Inside himself, he was still screaming, still hysterical, with fear still burning with rage whenever he was controlled. And they began to identify that, pray about that, and bring healing into that. So the process is we need to first identify the sour grapes, and then we can begin the process of pruning. So we talk about that pruning for a second. Proper pruning of the past isn't a way to blame your parents or conjure up more anger or revenge. It's a way to actually honor what our parents did right, at the same time choose what we're not going to bring with us. And by doing that, we move from repeating the past, because we've identified it, to reacting to the past, because we're honoring them while we're making different decisions, so that we can respond rather than repeating or reacting. Notice how God says it. Here's the process. You go back 2 generations. If there's a man is just, and he begets a son who doesn't follow his dad's way, becomes a robber or shedder of blood, and that man begets a son, so 3 generations, grandchild, father, and grandfather. Here's what you need to do to prune. You need to see all the mistakes, all the sins, all the areas that your fathers or grandfathers have done. And 2, once you see it, consider it. Did that work out well? Is that what I want to be part of my life? Was that effective in my relationships and his relationships? And then, do not do likewise. Okay, I'm going to leave that behind. So it's real practical. See what it was that happened in the past. Consider whether or not that was effective. And then choose to do differently. And God works through that process of digging into the pruning of our vines. Now, he mentions it. Again, it's 3 generations. So what we did a few weeks ago is we went back from ourselves to our father to our grandfathers. And so we could see this. And in order for this not to be a punish your ancestors, because our kids are going to talk about all the mistakes we've made, I talked about 2 phrases that we can use to do this in an honorable way. Phrase number 1 is, we look at what our parents or grandparents did and say, oh, I like that. That was a strength. I want to carry this forward. Oh, and this area that my parents worked for them but won't work for me, I want to leave this behind. See how that can be honorable? In fact, my parents listened to these CDs, so I'm going to walk you through my family and their mistakes, and I hope I'm honoring this because they're probably going to hear it. What are the things that our parents did that we want to leave behind, and what are the things we want to carry forward? So, in order to do that, we designed this series and created a tool that we thought would be very practical in helping you with that. So I want to walk you through a process of pruning yesterday's sour grapes. We're going to examine 6 family vines. If you have a blended family, like many of us do, we have an opportunity to put stepfathers or stepmothers in as well. So as you came in today, we gave you a program. If you want to pull that out, I've already done some work on mine. And we're going to give you an opportunity to do that. And as you do that, I want you to notice that even in the book of Ezekiel, he mentions the very subjects that our psychologists mentioned. God says, I want you to look at specifically how your parents handled intimacy and sex. If a man is just and does what is lawful and right, doesn't defile his neighbor's wife, look into how adultery or unfaithfulness or those sort of messages about sex impacted you? How you handled money? The Bible mentions, did you use money to control others or oppress people? Was money used to control whether or not you obeyed? Have you restored to the debtor his pledge? Did you keep your word and repay? Did your word mean something? Did you ever use your money in inappropriate ways to rob others? Were you generous? Was money a tool to be generous to others? Did you exact usury, which is inappropriate interest to exploit or keep people in bondage? And lastly, how did your grandparents and parents use power? Did they execute true judgment, or did they manipulate things to their own advantage? So, here's the program we're going to look at. I'm going to walk you through my family. As we do that, we're going to have a little harp playing behind me. And I want just to sort of get in the mood of reflection. Now, you might say, Chet, I'm not going to write this down. I got nosy people sitting next to me, and I don't really want them to see what's going on. So you might want to write in code. And you'll see at the bottom of the page, I've created some categories for sour grapes. What was modeled for you when it came to grief? What was modeled for you when it came to how you handled conflict? What was modeled for you just in career and job? Parenting? Money? Anger? Intimacy? Words? And depression. Now, in the time we're going to spend the next 12 minutes together, we're not going to go through all that. I'm just going to walk you through some of the things I've identified as sour grapes from my past. And I want you to use this tool to dig in. You could literally spend probably a half hour digging into each areas of these. So that the more you dig into this, the more potential you have to break patterns and ask God to bring some change into that. I want to begin with my father's side. So my grandfather, I mentioned a few weeks ago that his name was Robert Hoven. Incredible Marine, incredibly selfless, giving man. And the flip side of that came a sour grape. And one of the sour grapes is my grandfather, though he was a Marine, and though he was strong, and though he liked helping other people, that came with a sense of codependence in that he would, well, here's an example. When he proposed to my grandmother, he said, Ione, do you want to marry me? And she said, I'm not sure I love you. And he said, I have enough love for the two of us. And so my grandpa was a romantic. My grandpa loved my grandmother like no one I've ever seen. My grandma was a horrific cook. And we're eating the food like, oh, this is so terrible. And grandpa is genuinely like, oh, Ione, you have outdone yourself. This is amazing. So there's a strength there that I want to carry forward. Honoring, accepting, looking past mistakes. But there's a real sour grape, which is that my grandmother was very selfish. And because my grandpa never challenged her on that, I don't think she became the woman she could have become. And I can see that codependence, that overhelping going through my family line. And so that's an area of, I just want to call it overhelping or codependence that has come into my family system. Now my grandma's side, as I mentioned, could be very self-centered, and my grandma was very, very defensive. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, my grandmother had a book of Christian books where she wrote notes in the corners, and it was always, Ross needs to work on this. Kent needs to work on this. Everyone needed to work on it except her. Her name never appeared. I went through all her books. Not once did she need to work on anything. And so when confronted with feedback, my grandma got very, very defensive. And I can see that in my father, and I can see that in my uncle. I was talking to my cousin the other day, and I was describing this story to him. He goes, oh my goodness. My dad is never wrong. He's never apologized. He never admits he's made a mistake. I said, well, let me tell you about, I lived closer to Grandma than you did. He's like, that explains so much. He said, if I didn't have a woman in my life who was so strong, kind but strong, in forcing me to not always bend reality to be what I wanted it to be, I'm not sure I'd become the man I am today in marriage. Defensive. And I'll just add with that, just no self-awareness because she's so defensive. So my father. And my father also has that tendency to be defensive, much more increased than my grandmother. He can see it much more, but there's still that inner child that will show up. We went to Sturgis together, and he got confronted by one of the motorcycle drivers on something that how he was planning it or controlling it. And I think it was inappropriate feedback. Most of it was certainly done in a very inappropriate way. But I was there with my son and I could see my dad was deeply hurt, deeply wounded. And instead of saying, hey, where might this guy be right? He just went, it's all wrong. He turned to the group of motorcyclists like, I guess you guys just want me to go home, even though I planned this whole thing and invited you on my trip. Oh, awkward moment. And I realized that defensiveness that my dad has actually made a lot of progress on my grandmother, that defensiveness still shows up in me. And so I try and be very careful that when somebody brings something up to say, I got to assume part of this might be true. Because I've got a heritage that tells me I always dismiss stuff because I want to make myself look better than I am. One more from my father is my father, when I looked at how he handled conflict, he was so good at not causing a scene, not trying to cause unnecessary conflict, and I want to carry that forward. There's just a lot of stuff that's not worth making a big deal about. But the thing I want to leave behind of my dad is that he could sometimes walk away too soon. Where my mom might have an issue that was really important to her, that really needed to be talked through, and by my dad walking away too soon because he didn't want to get angry. My dad never yelled at us. My dad never cursed. My dad had a lot of things I want to bring with me. But because he didn't want to lose control, often he would just drop subjects that really need to be resolved. And so as I've come into marriage, I did a lot of this work when I was in my 20s. I said, I want to take what my dad did well, but I don't want to walk away too soon because there's things in life that need to be talked through. There's such a thing called healthy conflict that I want to work through. So with those, a couple things that have come into me, defensiveness and certainly this over-responsibility or taking responsibility, doing not just my part, but maybe other people's part as well. It shows up at work for me. It shows up in marriage for me. It shows up with my kids, doing more than maybe I should to get them on the right path. And as I've been able to identify this over the years, I've been able to go, okay, I know what to look out for. God, help me. What's the lie that's driving this? So maybe some things have come to your mind. I want to give you just a minute or two as she plays, and I want you to pull out your forms, and I want you to just, if you don't want to do it live because you got nosy people, just think about it. If you want to put a code on there, that's fine. But I want you to just begin thinking. And here's one last little hint. I said at the beginning, when you say to yourself, why doesn't Grandma know she's? Why doesn't my dad? Why can't he change blah? That'll give you a hint to the road we're on. Start writing some of those together and see how they may be trickling into your life as well. And then I'll come back, we'll do the mother side. Yeah, I think if you commit to yourself to take this tool, I try to make this tool with a whole team of folks as practical as possible because this could save you like 100 hours of counseling. I'm trying to save you some money because counselors are often way too passive and they don't help you dig into this stuff. I'm telling you, this can help. It's helped me a lot. It brought a lot of freedom in my life in a way that I don't operate in bitterness toward my parents. I'm incredibly grateful for my parents did right. But I've also decided not to pull forward some things they've done wrong. Let me show you some examples from my mom's side of the family. And then we'll give you one more chance. And again, just as I'm talking, feel free to, if ideas pop up, you're like, oh, that was mine. Let me tell you about my grandfather again. I mentioned him a few weeks ago. His name is Larry. I love Larry. Larry was incredibly generous and loved people. People would come over to our grandpa's house, and they were upper, lower class family, maybe a lower middle class family, but did not have a lot of money. But my grandpa worked really, really hard. I want to take that with me. My grandpa loved people. I want to take that with me. Grandpa would always disappear when somebody came over for needed help, and we didn't know where they went. They would just come back later and have dinner together. And when my grandpa passed away, we cleaned out the basement, which was quite an undertaking. And we found $100 bills stuffed in little corners and cracks in the bricks. Because Grandpa purposely put money away, and he didn't have a lot, so that if people came over and had needs, he could provide for them. We found $5,000 tucked into little corners in the basement. And so my grandfather cared about people. He loved people. He was incredibly generous. That's what I want to take with me. But Grandpa was pretty silent when it came to words. I so wish my mother had heard my grandfather honor and cherish her more. Now, she knows that Grandpa loved her. I just wish he was better with words. And so I would just say Grandpa was a sour grape I don't want to bring with is maybe emotionally unavailable, especially in the form of words. I mentioned he was sort of a stoic Lutheran. And he made up for a lot of that with gift giving, but I'm not sure you make up for lack of words. And so I want to make sure that family line coming through my family vineyard is something that I choose to leave behind. Because I think about if Grandpa had done this work, then maybe, it would have impacted what my mother grew up with, which would impact what I grew up with. And thank goodness my mom did some great work on this, and I got to be the beneficiary of a lot of her work, of being incredible in giving words of affirmation to us. But I also, again, this isn't punish Grandpa, I didn't go to World War II. I didn't see the horrible things he saw. And I would imagine that maybe silence was the best coping mechanism he had. So I want to honor him for he found a way to express love. I just don't want to take his silence or lack of words into our family tree. Now, my grandmother, I love my grandmother. I learned to play great games from my grandmother. I would say the sour grape that I want to leave behind for my grandmother, I'm taking fun, I'm taking people, I'm taking hospitality. I want to leave behind some inflexibility. Grandma had a certain way things had to be done. She had these throw rugs all around the house. And my dad one time pulled me on the couch. He said, how many times do you think Grandma fixes those throw rugs every day? He goes, I've counted 62 so far. They had to go here. And every time you walk past it, she'd go and readjust it. Every time you finished eating, you had to do the dishes before you could play games or before you could talk. Just how it was. My mom, I remember, in one of those reaction versus repeat, she said, we don't have to do dishes. We can play games right now before we wipe up the table. I'm not going to be like my mom. And I appreciated that. But I also went, that sounds like a little bit you're still tied to the past a bit, because we're not just doing it because we like playing games without the dishes. You're doing it in reaction to your mom. Again, not a big deal, but these are the little ways we get hooked to the past. So inflexibility. The other one I'd say is my grandma, very enabling. Because she was so loving, because she loved people so much, I had a relative who had a severe addiction, and she never was able to have the hard talk. She was never able to say, you need to face the consequences of this. I'm not going to bail you out for the 20th time. So much so that when my grandmother died, my mom was sitting at the bed with her, and my grandmother turned to my mom and said, you need to make sure you take care of this person, this relative, now that I'm gone. My mom was really distraught. She's also got a tender heart. She's also very caring. And suddenly the baton is about to be passed from one generation to another. Your job is to keep enabling this addict. My mom called me and said, what do you think I should do? I said, do not pick up that baton. Tell Mom I'm going to love him. I'm going to care for him. But I cannot promise you I'm going to bail him out. I'm not sure. He's 50. It may be time to grow up. But see, when you have a generational pattern of wanting to help, that help can end up hurting. Which moves me to my mom. I mentioned the other day, I had a list of 20 things of what my mom did right. I would just call it overhelping. My mom had and have a fantastic relationship, but sometimes my friendship with my mom was stronger than her friendship with my dad. Now, that might not be true. Some of this stuff is just perception. So sometimes I felt like some over-responsibility. It was my job to keep them together. And they had a good marriage, but I inappropriately was supposed to over-help in different ways, and that showed up. Even I shared last year about fearing depression as my daughter went off to college. And one of the reasons I was so fearful of that or reacting to that is I saw my mom go through depression when I left to college. But I had tracked that years earlier, I'll talk about that next week, and be able to say, I want to make sure that I enjoy my kids and have friendship with my kids for 50 years, but I don't want my kids to think they're my life. That way I can release them. And I can grieve the fact that they're leaving without being devastated. I'm happy to say a year later, I feel like I've been through a healthy process of grief. I didn't hide from depression. I grieved through that process. I'm much healthier because of it. But I had to make some very conscious decisions in that and how I handled that. And lastly, when it came to conflict, where my dad had a tendency to walk away, I want to take with me my mom's ability to form an argument, her ability to clearly articulate what she thinks, what she believes, what she perceives. These are things I want to take with me. But sometimes my mom was so smart and so articulate, she would overwhelm my father, which is probably why he walked away. So I wanted to not walk away like my dad, but I also wanted to be careful not to overwhelm people with my words, which I've not done a great job with my career, certainly. But in relationships, I will often turn to my son, my daughter, my wife, and say, I just want to talk for 15 minutes to give the space and the freedom so that I don't overwhelm them. I don't want to win at all costs. And I don't think my mom did either. But those are ways in which I want to make sure I learned the lesson those went before me. So let me give you just a couple moments as the harp continues to play. And again, look through those different lists and whichever subjects you want to delve into here in the next few minutes. And just ask yourself, what are some of those things that may have impacted you? Well, we'll pause there. For some of you who are introspective, you're like, finally we slowed down the service to think. And some of you are like, crying out loud, are we still going on with this? This is more thinking I've done on the subject in 30 years. So again, here's my hope. My hope is that this wasn't a series that you just show up to, and as we finish it next week, where you go, that's interesting, that's good stuff, that's a good quote. We've been trying to create this more like a workshop where you can really get into the stuff that we don't ever make time to do. But honestly, we created this tool in hopes that you'll be able to identify these pieces. And again, remember what Ezekiel said. You see everything that's happened, what has happened that maybe wasn't good, the sour grapes of the past, and you deliberately make that list and consider how you're not going to do likewise. And trigger, what are the things that contributed to this? And so I hope this is a great discussion tool for you and your spouse, for you and your friends, for you and your parents. No, it's not one for my parents. Never mind. I'm going to cross that one off. What are ways in which you can honor what our parents have done well and carry it forward? And what are ways we can deliberately and intentionally choose to increase our radar to the things that we're going to leave behind? So what I want to do is we've opened a few little doors tonight to some maybe, or this morning to some things maybe that you have never thought about, or that maybe there's some grief, or maybe it feels dishonoring to mention this. I hope we've done it in an honorable way. But I want to ask that God would just help you, give you the courage to change, the courage to invite Him into that stuff. One of my favorite verses in Joel says that God can repay or restore for the years the locusts have eaten. And some of us have to grieve some ways the locusts have been eaten in our life. Have taken away some things we wished we'd had. We wish we could have heard those words, I love you, I'm proud of you, I believe in you. We need to grieve that process, but God says He can enter into those moments and those stages and bring about a whole new harvest. Because though our parents have contributed to who we are, they don't control who we become. Let's pray. Father, I just ask that Father, your Spirit would just give freedom. We just thank you for your grace, God, that you know that not one of us here is even remotely close to doing it right. As a dad, as a friend, as a son, as a cousin, God, we all fall so short. But God, I ask that you in your grace would accept us where we are. And in the freedom of that acceptance, in the freedom of knowing you love us where we are with whatever's happened, God, we could bring our private self and our public self together. And God, that you would whisper to that scared child that shows up every once in a while that we are secure in you. You would whisper to that driven child within us that we don't have to earn all that approval. You offer it freely to us. And God, it's out of that freedom and out of that grace, God, that we can make decisions that walk our whole family, our whole friendship, our whole influence in our life into a greater place of freedom and less in bondage. That this would be the beginning of a process. Before I say amen, maybe you just want to hear these words from God as He says to you, I am proud to be your father. I believe in you. I love you. I accept you where you are, and I want to help give you the courage and wisdom to make the changes that you can make. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, thank you for being with us today. We're going to finish up our series next week by doing what's called a genogram if you've never done it before. If you came prepared to give, there's some offering boxes on the way out. Thanks for being here. Hopefully this tool will be helpful for you. We'll see you all next week.